Something you might not know is John Omer Bruce Street marries a girl in Jacksboro, Texas at the courthouse in 1872. And it's in 1872 that the two brothers actually buy free land or get free land near what we call Prophet today in Elm Creek, and they clear 500 acres of land, and they decide they're going to put that in cultivation. Well, when they would put that in cultivation, that means they usually use a one-horse, one-row plow in order to do that. So they sow it all in wheat, they get ready for the crop to be harvested, and grasshoppers come and wipe them out. Something else you need to know about these two characters is they never became naturalized citizens, so they were always immigrants. I don't know if that was a decision they based or they just got too busy with life to really worry about it. Something else I found out is I have a really good friend who her great-great-grandfather is a man called W.A. Bill Ribble. And I looked through his diary about 6 weeks ago and actually took pictures of the diary. And he wrote his diary in about 1874, reminding himself or remembering what he saw in Young County. Bill Ribble came to Young County in 1849, and this was in his diary, and I thought it would be worth sharing with you. Bill Ribble, 1874. Bill Ribble of Gooseneck Bend met S.B. Street on the road with 4 wagons with buffalo hides on his way to Sherman. One wagon and trailer had 4 yoke of oxen hitched to it, and the other 3 had 1 yoke. S.B. Street had 1,500 buffalo hides on his 4 wagons. He was driving them, and he was on a pony. He told me later he sold the buffalo hides and bought lumber, hauling it back to Young County so that he could sell it. I thought that was an interesting insight into S.B. Street. Something else I need to tell you about is that before there was Facebook, before there were emails, before there were text messages, there was the Graham Leader. And one of the things the Graham Leader did is the Graham Leader told everything. And so I'm not going to tell you everything that's in this document, but I will say this. If you want a copy of this, I'll be glad to share it with you. Email Ann and I'll give her the master copy of it. But basically this is what I did. I read every issue of the Graham Leader from 1876 to 1926 and took out every place that the word street family was found in those 50 years. And so let me share with you some of these things. 1876, Colonel E.S. Graham is opening up and properly locating some of the streets in town. The square is cleaned out. August 16th, 1876, S.B. Street subscribes to a new newspaper in town and pays his $1 a year. Well, S.B. Street is a charter subscriber of the Graham Leader, and he will pay for the Graham Leader and read the Graham Leader until he passes away. And he is one of those few charter subscribers. 1877, John Orr Bruce Street and Spencer Street are selling horses in Graham. They need to pay their taxes. And not only that, they lose horses. I thought this was interesting, the Graham Leader. John Street writes these words, "We're missing 2 horses. 1 bay mare about 15 hands high, black mane and tail, good condition, shod and branded. The second horse, 1 flea-bitten gray, 9 to 10-year-old horse, 15 hands high. Don't remember if it has a brand, but it will follow the mare." John Street, June 1878. Spencer Street married Miss Susan Ada Hodgson, his sweetheart from Maine. In the paper that same year, it says Spencer Street is building a handsome cottage on Plum Street in a pretty grove of trees east of the Methodist Episcopal Church. 1879, April 23rd, it's a boy. There's a street boy at their house. That's all it says. And we think that that's Spencer Boyd Street. 1880. S.B. Street is now a member of the Oddfellows Society, Adelphi Lodge number 261. They meet every Saturday evening. He's the secretary. S.B. Street is enjoying the fish fry. So they have a citywide fish fry up on the square. And so who do you think fries the fish? S.B. Street. He's in charge of frying the fish, but he's not alone. There's other people as well. But here's something that's also kind of curious. So remember in 1878, S.B. Street marries Susan Ada Hodgson. Well, in 1880, she has a job. She is Knight of the Yardstick at W.C. Beckham and Sons Mercantile, and that's in 1880. Now, basically what that meant is that she sold fabric, and she was also in charge of what we call the millinery department. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but ladies, in that time period, the hat was what it was all about, and the bustle. And so you had to look a certain way, and that's one of the jobs that she had. I had no idea until I started researching the family tree. 1881, May the 9th. This is all it says in the Graham Leader. It's a boy, another street. Now, I think that's Horace Bruce Street. Something else it tells us in 1881 is Mr. Connor dug a well for Mr. S.B. Street at his home. But S.B. Street also was a member of the Young County Wool Growers Association, and a contingent of men went to Austin, Texas to be a part of that. In 1882, John Orr Bruce Street came back, and it says in the newspaper he came and visited just for a very short visit of 6 months with his brother S.B. Street. In 1883, October the 14th, the Graham Leader says, "It's a girl." How could that girl Street come about? Well, something we know is that's Alice or Allie Street. She attended Graham School. She graduated from Graham. She loved piano lessons. She graduated from Graham High School at the age of 16 in 1899. She went to Sherman's North Texas Female College in the fall. And then after 2 years, she went to Catholic Ursuline Academy in Dallas, where she graduated in 1901. But he also told me something. What happened in the world to John Orr Bruce Street? Well, in 1883, he's the county surveyor in Wheeler County, and the only reason I know that is because there's a newspaper article in the Dallas Morning News of a big lawsuit, and his name is there. And it just tells you about it. It doesn't tell you much information. 1884, December 4th, Anna Bertha Graham is born, the youngest child of Colonel E.S. and Addie Graham. Miss Graham spent most of her life in Graham, which is named for her father and uncle. She attended school in Graham, Miss Semple's School at Louisville, Kentucky, and St. Mary's School in Dallas for travel. And here's what I found something very interesting. I found out that S.B. Street has a business. And I know you're thinking, oh, that's S.B. Street and Company, the mercantile. But it's actually called the Jim Drug Store. And here's what it said in the classified ads. Dealers in pure drugs, chemicals, patent medicines, paints, oils, brushes, varnishes. And so a look in the county records tells me that S.B. Street and Company actually bought out Rias Drug Store. And what they decided to do is that Burkett decided to go back to Weatherford, and so S.B. Street and Company hired their very first druggist. His name was Dr. S.A. Catlin. Well, S.A. Catlin doesn't mean anything really to a lot of us, but S.A. Catlin, about 6 months later, would be indicted for murder. One of the reasons he was indicted is because in that time period when they filled medicine, they just got a jar off the shelf, and that's what he did. And so he got this jar off the shelf and filled it up with quinine. This man was having problems with malaria, so he took the quinine, dropped dead. And they thought, what in the world happened? Well, the only thing that Dr. Catlin hadn't realized is that when they scraped the labels off, the first label on that earthen jar was strychnine. And so what he had done is that even though it was empty, he put the quinine in and it just absorbed it. And one of the things it says in the newspaper in 1885 is that J.E. Rias and S.B. Street decided to call their new business venture Rias Street and Company, especially after the circumstances with Dr. Catlin. Well, no matter, this is an ad, it says, no matter what doctor writes your prescription, take it to Rias and Street for dispensing. Their stock is complete, their charges are low, and we have new bottles. Here's another ad I thought was funny. It says, there is nothing compared to Rias Bilious Tea. Try it. It's for sale at Street and Company in Graham. Now, bilious tea, what that means in the 1880s is, let me use a generic word today, X-lax, all right? And so that's what he was trying to get. Drink this tea, and this will cure all the things that ail you. Well, that year, something else happened. It also says there's a new business in town in 1885, and this new business is called Morrison and Street Mercantile. Now, Rias and Street is still in the drug business, but Morrison Street said, we will give 40 cents per bushel of corn. We'll give 25 cents for oats. We'll give 60 cents for wheat, or you can apply it to your bill. And not forget this, make sure to pick up Boo's Live Hominy and Whole Corn at Morrison and Street. Well, Boo's is an unusual hominy. Now, you know what hominy is. You take corn and you put lye on it, and it kind of expands. Well, Boo's also used 50% alcohol in order to expand the hominy. And it was quite entertaining and also quite the sales product. In 1886, Morrison and Street are dealers in all kinds of family groceries, county produce. It's over on the north side of the square. In 1887, Morrison Street is selling molasses for 45 cents a gallon, sugar for 14 pounds for $1. And this is one of my most favorite stories. Morrison and Street in January received a whole lot of Christmas candles, and Espy Street can only account for the fact that Johnny Morrison spent the past week in wicked Fort Worth and may have gotten inebriated. He met the wicked people of that place. They got on a wicked whiz, and Johnny Morrison thought it was Christmas in January, so he bought all those candles. Well, they're not finished. The Juvenile Missionary Society met as usual last Sunday at the Methodist Church in 1887. We noticed that Little Boyd Street did remarkably well. Morrison Street and Company bought and shipped 20,000 pounds of pecans in 1887, and they sold it for $40,000. Well, let me put that into context. That would be $978,000 in today's money. Not only that, they sold 154 bales of cotton for $8.40 cash money. In today's money, that would be $220 for a bale of cotton. In 1888, Harry Hodgson of St. Paul, Minnesota, brother of Mrs. Espy Street, is visiting. He only visited 6 months, and then here's this ad that was in the paper. Morrison Street now is offering something for every woman in Graham. Dr. Brown's self-adjusting corset. Lumber, 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 and more lumber. January 18th, 1889. Another boy at Espy Street's house, Glenn Q. Street, Sr. At Morrison Street and Company, dealers in dry goods. Master Boyd Street has now taken a position in the dry goods house of Morrison Street and Company. But something tragic happened in that year. The granary behind Morrison Street and Company burned. It was discovered at 5 in the morning. The scarcity of water proved ineffective. They lost 600 bushels of oats, 500 bushels of wheat, and 2,000 bushels of corn. And the most sobering part of the newspaper article was this: there was no insurance. Well, Morrison Street and Company continue to expand. They buy what we call the Beckham Block. So the Beckham Block is the north side of the square, beginning where Kerwin Stevens' office is, all the way to the end of the block on the north side. And so Street and Company, Morrison Street, which is Johnny Morrison, and the street is Espy Street, they buy the entire block in 1890. Espy Street and wife left in August for the east. Mr. Street goes to St. Louis, and his wife went to Iowa to visit relatives. And they took their they left their two boys, Boyd and Bruce, in care of Mr. and Mrs. E.B. Norman. So Mr. and E.B. Norman lived right behind where the Espy Street house is, that 1904 Espy Street. That's E.B. Norman. Something else you need to know about E.B. Norman is E.B. Norman is a partner with this Street and Company business as well. 1891, Boyd Street is on the honor roll in the 7th grade. For a yearly average, he had 87. Bruce Street is on the honor roll in the 4th grade. 1892, Mr. H. Hodgson, brother of Mrs. Espy Street, is in Graham visiting from his home in Iowa. He's only able to be there 3 months. 1894, January the 12th, one more boy at the Espy Street house. And we think that's Spencer Orr Street. 1895, the firm of Morrison Street and Company dissolves. Espy Street, R.E. Mabry get the dry goods. Johnny Morrison and Sons get the grocery business. That's the good news. That's April. September of 1895, the Graham side of the square burns down. And the fire begins really about where Kerwin Stevens' office is. That's the old Beckham National Bank. Well, everything to the west of that burns straight to the ground. This is what I thought was so curious about that. So the SBC side, he lost $36,000. That's what his loss was. In today's money, that's $875,000. He had $17,000 insurance, which in today's money would be $460,000. The fire caught in the back of SB Street's building, and there's a good chance that it could have been electrical problems. But the problem is there's no electricity. But that's not what the fire marshal says. The fire marshal says it was electrical problems. I'm still trying to figure that out. But SB Street and Company, they build a new building. Has a handsome iron and zinc front. It takes about 6 months to build it. SB Street went to St. Louis and Chicago. He was accompanied by his son, Boyd Street, who's attending Jim Business College at Quincy, Illinois. I might tell you that all those street boys, those early street boys, went to that same college. They all went there to learn the business. SB Street and the merchants decide that maybe we need fire protection. And so SB Street and Johnny Morrison organized a hook and ladder company. And they decide we need to have a waterworks, we need to have a pump. In 1898, Boyd Street graduated from the Jim Business College. In 1900, Spencer Boyd Street begins his tenure as superintendent of the First Methodist Church. He is the superintendent of the First Methodist Church for 23 years. And when he begins, he's a single man and he's 21 years of age. Now, I think that probably what happened, if I know church politics very well, he may have missed a meeting. And so what happened is they looked around and said, who's not here? Well, Spencer's not here. He is now our superintendent of Bible classes. Something else that we know, too, is SB Street had lots of lumber. They had lots of shingles. And in 1900, this may sound novel to us, but in 1900, all the merchants on the square, with the leadership of SB Street, decide that they're going to close on Saturdays at 7 o'clock, and that no one will even meet. And something else that's kind of curious is that SB Street makes a decision that in 1900 that all stores in downtown Graham will close on Thanksgiving Day. Before then, that was a big sale time. In 1901, SB Street is secretary of the American Bible Society. In 1901, he is the leader of the Epworth League. In 1901, SB Street and Company sell all of their lumber to W.C. Bowman, and they get out of the lumber business. They're done then. Something else that's kind of curious about it, in 1902, Street and Company dissolves. The firm was owned by SB Street and R.E. Mabry. It was a friendly dissolve, and yet the reason was Mr. Street decided he wanted to move west. Now what we find out is that actually the boys get involved with the business. And so SB Street and Company really actually means SB Street and the boys. And so one of the things that I tracked down is I found out that they opened stores in a lot of different places. They opened stores in Rule and in Haskell and Clarendon and Paducah. They just spread out. They went to an area that many of you probably don't even know this town. It's called Swenson. And Swenson's right outside of Aspermont, out in the middle of nowhere. And crazy as this may sound, I actually know where all the buildings were that they actually had businesses in. And it wasn't called Street and Company in that time period. It was called something completely different. Something else is that SB Street joins the Masonic Lodge. He becomes secretary. He becomes a worshipful master. In 1904, SB Street begins the erection of a handsome residence on his property in the east part of Graham. They begin adding on to their store. In 1905, Glenkew Street attends Jim Business College. In 1907, Miss Alice Street marries Harry A. Wadsworth at her parents' home. And you may remember that that's the day the waterworks is completed. In 1910, February 25th, SB Street dies on a train. He's returning from buying goods in Chicago. He's accompanied on his trip by his oldest son, Spencer Boyd Street. And so at this time period is when those boys really start getting involved with their family business. In 1911, after a trip to Europe with a group of Graham people in the summer of 1911, Bruce married Bertha Graham. Miss Graham had taken a trip to Europe. On their return to the United States, they married on August 16, 1911 at the Chelsea Hotel in New York. And they make their home. They make their home here. And so many of you know about Anna Bertha's sister who passed away and her brother-in-law who passed away, and so they raised the 3 Craig children in the old house that used to be located up here. It's quite an experience. It's quite a story about their courtship and falling in love. In 1912, the Graham leader was surprised. The Streets have twins. Edwin Bruce Street and Malcolm Boyd Street are born. Something else they decided to do in 1913 is that all businesses on the square would close at 6 o'clock. Something else we found out is that Mr. and Miss Bruce Street, Mrs. Addie Graham, Miss Agnes Craig, Miss Mary Craig, Miss Catherine Craig, all left for Winslow, Arkansas to spend the summer. And that will be every summer. Every summer they will spend time there. Now, here's the name of that store I told you about. It's called the Hill Street and Alexander store. I found it in the rural newspaper, in the Haskell newspaper. I found the location of it. And they had this business for years. It started in 1913 until they closed the stores in the 1930s. Now, here's something I thought was funny. Here's a novel idea, 1914. In 1914, they decide we're going to have Clean Up Graham Day. And basically, this is exactly what it says in the article. All citizens are requested to clean up their property, alleys, sidewalks, and place in receptacles or piles in the alley. Wagons will be furnished by the city to get trash removed conveniently. Signed, Boyd Street, Mayor. And so now he's involved himself in the city. In 1915, I need to share this with you. This is out of the annual, the Graham Annual. Miss Mabel Louise Flanagan was one of the most popular teachers of Graham High School in 1915 to 1916. The high school annual describes her as plump and pretty. She inspired her pupils to do good work. She is their friend, and it passes above dispute that no one can help like her. The seniors hate to think that this is her last year in Graham. Miss Mabel Louise Flanagan taught English at Graham High School. Her favorite saying was this: "People who are afraid of freckles never make hay while the sun shines." Well, one of the things else we know about 1915 is that's when John Orr Bruce Street passes away in Oklahoma. And as things changed, the Graham brothers continued to own businesses throughout the area. Boyd Street and H.B. Street contributed to the Confederate Memorial down here on the square. The first golf club is organized in Graham. The group is M.K. Graham, E.S. Graham, wouldn't you know it, a Methodist preacher, R.E. Lynch, S.B. Street, and H.B. Street. And they're going to play in the Carnahan pasture. And I'll be glad to show you where that is. But something else was pivotal that year in 1915. Mr. and Mrs. Bruce Street took their twin sons to Fort Worth for throat treatment, and it was decided then they would need to have their tonsils and adenoids taken out. Now, can you imagine that being in the local paper today? Oh, how crazy it is. But in 1917, this is a curious one to me. In 1917, Bruce Street purchased the old school building with the lots and will build a handsome new home in the future. There are no prettier lots in Graham than these. Well, those lots are down here on 4th Street. It's about where the pump supply is, or by one of the restaurants down there. It was a big group, and I don't know that he ever actually built a house there, but it's interesting that he would even think about it. 1918. This is a pivotal year for the Street brothers. Every year, the Street brothers would leave Graham for a month, and they would either go to St. Louis or they'd go to Chicago, and they would buy stuff that they would sell in the springtime and the fall. And 1918 is the very first time that one of the Street brothers or a Street family member do not go to Chicago or to St. Louis to buy goods. They send 2 single ladies that are working for them. One of the ladies is Minnie Reuben Kinney, and the other lady is Lucy Stroud. But it's kind of interesting that that's the very first time, and still until you start realizing how many children they have. And I'm thinking that their wives said, "You're not leaving me here with these kids for a month. You're going to stay here with me." 1918, 1920, they still go to Winslow, Arkansas. About 1920, on July the 8th, the Graham leader just says these words: "S.B. Street welcomes a girl. Her name is Louise." Wow! In 1921, we see something new in the Graham Leader. It says SB Street and Company Store, 507 4th Street. That's the very first time in the records it's identified where it is. I found it in my phone books. I have the earliest phone books in Graham. And on you're thinking to yourself, why now? Why this? Well, they paved the streets in Graham. And when they started paving the streets in Graham with that brick, iconic brick we see all around, then it just makes sense that, hey, maybe we ought to have numbers on these places. Well, it also coincides with one of the other street brothers, Glenn Q. Street. Glenn Q. Street becomes fire marshal in 1921, and guess what? In that time period, when you were elected to city council, you got to choose what you wanted to do. And he said, I'll be the fireman. You know, one of the things that's neat about Q Street is, as far as I know, Q doesn't mean anything. It's just Q. But one of the things that's neat about him, he was with the Graham Volunteer Fire Department for 35 years. And not only that, he was the very first fire chief for the fire department and served for a number of years. In 1921, the Graham Chamber of Commerce is organized. SB Street, HB Street, Q Street are members. Ground is broken for a new Methodist church, and of course SB Street decides that he's going to be on the decision-making process. The very first service in 1922, he's there as well. In 1923, he resigns as superintendent of the First Methodist Church, but on July 23rd, the Graham Leader says, it's a girl! And that's Marjorie Clare Street. In 1924, we find out that students in the Graham schools in the 1924-25 year are Glenn Q. Street Jr., Malcolm Boyd Street, Edwin Bruce Street, Robert Graham Street, and Francis Stewart Street. In 1925, they bring in their very first bale of cotton. In 1926, Horace Bruce Street and Ella Davison become partners in a car dealership in Ranger, Texas. And they sell LaSalle and Cadillacs. And I remember one time, I asked Mr. Street Sr., I said, what was it like to have your own car dealership? And he only had two things to share with me, two words of wisdom. The first word of wisdom he had to share with me is, it was just too much work. And then the second word of wisdom he gave to me is, he said, you could get a new Cadillac every year. Well, I was so intrigued by that story that one time I was at Louisa's house and I was chatting with her about the house, and if you hadn't been in that house, you need to go in that house. It's beautiful. And Louise, I may be wrong in telling this story, but I remember one time in our discussion, I was talking about her mother and father, and I said, you know, tell me something about this kitchen. And she said, one Christmas, she said, my father came home and told my mother, I'm going to get you a new Cadillac for Christmas. And she looked at him and she said, well, I would rather have a new gas stove. And that's what happened. She didn't get the new Cadillac that year. They took out the old wood-burning stove that she used to cook with and put in a new gas stove instead, which I just can't even imagine cooking on a wood stove. Am I pretty close to that story? Yes. Pretty close. 1928, Shawnee Country Club is organized. S. Boyd Street is the president. The clubhouse is to be built. The land for the golf course has been purchased. So where that clubhouse was located is over on Pine Tree Road, not very far from Walmart. And if you go to Fairway, over there behind the hospital, that's where the golf course was located. This is one of my most favorite parts. It says, Glenn Q. Street and Malcolm Boyd Street won the senior boys 50-yard swim meet at the new Cane Tuck swimming pool. And they got a trophy. So, do you still have the trophy? Probably it's gone somewhere. But Boyd and Bruce Street played football that year, and I talked to Bruce Street about playing football. And he told me that in that time period, everybody had nicknames. And nicknames were a big thing for them. During the years that they played football, they played with another guy named Gene Wignall, who was the quarterback at the time. And Gene Wignall failed his senior year so that he could play football one more year. So he played quarterback for Graham football team 5 years. And so in 1930, Graham played a football game against a town called Bellevue. And Graham beat that team 168-0. And I asked Gene Wignall about it, and he said it was the most amazing game. He said, all we did was kick off to them. When they fumbled, then we picked up the ball and ran in for a touchdown. And he said by halftime, it was 70-0. Well, Bellevue quit playing football after 1930, and I can understand why. But I asked Bruce, I said, tell me about your football career. And he said, we all had nicknames. So Wignall's nickname was Waggy, okay? Well, here's what Bruce's nickname is. He was Scrappy. And so I said, what does that mean? And he said, you just have to read the papers and see what it says. Now, I think that was kind of his challenge to me, because what I did is I went back and read the papers and looked at the annuals to see what it was like. And I went back to him and I said, okay, here's what I read about your exploits in football. And I said, you had two positions. And I said, one position is get back. So that way when you went to the coach and said, can I play now? He said, get back. And I said, the other place was left out. And he said, how do you figure that? And I said, well, you always felt left out. You just didn't really want to play football. You just did it because everybody else played football. And he said, oh, you need to go back and read those papers again. And so sure enough, I went back and looked for the annuals and read them again, and I found out that actually Glenn Q Street might have been the great athlete, but he got injured after the second game, and so then they had to put in Bruce and Boyd. And Bruce and Boyd would switch out. And, really they were average, pretty decent football players, even though maybe Bruce would never tell you that. In 1934, SB Street and Company closes, and then in 1935, Spencer Boyd Street begins serving as postmaster in Graham. One of the things about the Street families that I've always noticed and I've read, so we've only covered 25 years, okay? So that means the next time you have a street reunion, you may have to invite me back so I can tell you about the other 25 years, or maybe the charming 25 years. But I want to say this about the Street families, and really the Graham families, and all the other families as they're interconnected. One of the things that was really charming to me about Boyd Street and his wife is I actually researched the house that they were living in to figure out how that house was built, who built it, and I actually found those things out. I found out a lot about your grandfather who lived in Fort Worth area. Another charming story, just a real neat story about really a famous banker, really a famous individual for what he was doing. And I just started looking at people's names. Now, before you start thinking that I'm stalking all of you, really what it is I'm just interested in people and places and things, even though I never came from here. I didn't grow up here. I don't have any Graham experiences except talking to my wife's grandparents through the years. But I will say this about the Street Graham families. Bruce Street Jr. told me something a long time ago. He says, I don't really care who gets the credit for it, as long as it's done right. And I would say that that's the family that is assembled here. One of the things that's really charming about Graham, Texas is it's full of people who have lived here all of their lives, who are all kin to each other, who may not necessarily be talking to each other, but they're all kin to each other. They all know too much about everybody else's business, and, it's Graham. But it's one of the things that's so charming about this town because of really families like you. Because what you've done for Graham in so many different ways is that you've created a place that we live in, and yet you don't really care who gets the credit. All you care about is, how can I help people? How can I make other people's life better? And really, in my opinion, that's the way I see the Street family. Thanks so much for inviting me to come.
Questions for Dorman?
My comment is outstanding and thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Well, I would say this. First time I ever met Bruce and Boyd, they were walking up the street, and they both had Walmart plastic bags in their hands. And, Bruce had striped yellow and black pants, and he had plaid shirt. And Boyd had a dark pants, and he had a striped shirt. And I had not been to Graham very long, maybe a month. And I pulled alongside of him, and I said, you guys need a ride somewhere? And Bruce said, no, our business is right up here. We're walking to our business. And I said, what are y'all doing? He said, picking up aluminum cans. You can get 10 cents a pound. And so I said, okay. And about maybe 2 months later, I went to a Chamber of Commerce meeting, and the church where I work for wanted me to get involved in the community, and that's what that was a big thing for them. And so I went and I sat down at the table, Well, there's that homeless man again, Mr. Street, and he's sitting next to me. And there's him and Ray Herring and all these guys that I didn't know who they were. And what do you think the very first question that Bruce Street asked me?
I have no idea.
Where do you go to church? First question he ever asked me, where do you go to church? And I told him where I went to church. The second question he asked me, he said, what do you do for a living? And I told him what I did for a living, and he said, hey, let me introduce you to these other people. Well, what is so surreal about that, I guess, in a sense, is in 1998, I gave a talk on the history of Graham, Texas. And I had never met any of the Grahams, and I really didn't know his connection with the Grahams at the time period. And after that was over with, I got to meet Bruce formally, I guess, and E.B. Harris and Ed Graham III. I got to meet Bruce Street Jr. and a lot of the others. And it's very surreal talking about Graham family history with Graham family out there and not really knowing that there's Graham family out here, because you know, it's actually a dream of a lifetime for me to get to meet most of you, because you know, I know who you are, but I'm not one of those people who's going to come up to your table and say, hi, I'm Norman Holub, and I like history, and I'd like to bug you. That's just not me. But, you know, I really thought a lot of Malcolm. I mean, what a super guy. I mean, just really a super guy. I thought a lot about Bruce Street Sr. I have a picture of Bruce Street in my office that Bruce Jr. let me have, and you know, there's not a day that didn't go by that I don't think about it, because you know, Bruce and Boyd. Bruce talked all a lot. Boyd never could get a word in edgewise. No offense, but that's just the way. But Bruce would come by my office at the church building, and we would talk about history all the time, or you know, we'd drive around the square, and I'd say, what's this? What was that? What was that? What was that? What was this? And, you know, I tell you up front, it's just, it's an humbling experience to be able to just really visit with you people, because, you know, I didn't know any of these characters that I talked to you about today, but I wish I'd gotten to know the Buffalo Hunter. I wish I'd known, you know, S.V. Street Sr. I knew Spencer Jr. He and I would talk about history all the time, and I'd go by and chat with him and visit with him, and he'd tell me all kinds of stories. I'm not sure how many were true, but he told me all kinds of stories. And some of the times I would go and visit with Louise and Marjorie. In fact, about 4 years ago, I guess, I spent 5 hours in their front room and just talking to them. And believe it or not, I have 5 hours of film of them talking about their experiences. And probably one of my most favorite stories about from them is on Sunday afternoons that they would come home and they would pull the rug away in that middle area, and they would dance. And my favorite part of that story is that they said, and we tried as hard as we could to teach Norman Stovall Jr. how to dance, but he just can't. And you know, that is just a treasure, because you know, these people have been at Graham a long, long time. They've got stories to tell. And that's what history is about. History is his story and her story. And if you tell yourself, well, I'll always remember these things, no, you won't. You know, those stories escape your mind. But, you know, again, I really appreciate getting to visit with you. Some of you I've dreamed about visiting with, and even getting to see you and meet you. But I thought, well, you know, I'll never get that chance. So I appreciate Ann inviting me over. And, you know, all good preachers should know that the brain can only handle what the bottom can endure. So thanks again.
I think we need to help you on the house down here, because you all were living in that house. So there
That's
was.
what mother and daddy got for a wedding present.
Oh, okay.
From Daddy Pop.
Okay.
Right next to camp construction.
Right,
Yeah,
there was a house right
Yeah,
down
okay,
here.
that's it, yeah.
There was a house right down here.
Lot next door that's, you know, divided the
Right.
tourist court.
Oh, okay,
I
okay.
had my horse
Oh, okay, well, that makes sense.
that Bruce took care of.
Yeah, little brothers. Okay, that's really about it. I think for our pictures, we'll probably leave, Marge and Louise over here, and we'll just try to get on the floor, or whatever. I'm gonna get Ronnie to get up as high as possible and get a picture of all of us, so we're gonna do that. But, I did wanna say, cross our fingers that we think it's gonna happen, but on October the 28th, there is going to be, we're going to council on Thursday, so, watch, I'll email you and let you know for sure, but I think it's gonna be okay. But we are going to, the Grand Regional Theater and the Fort Belknap Archives are putting on a Talkin' Tombstones. It's going to be in Oak Grove Cemetery. We're not covering the Street family this year, but we hope that it goes really well, and we're going to add to it over the years, where we're, telling the stories of some of the residents of the cemetery. And Bruce and I will be portraying Addie and E.S. Graham. So that will be kind of interesting. So we're the people that we're going to visit are Addie and E.S., Edmonia and G.A. Graham, and then Annie Morrison, who's Johnny Morrison's wife that you talked about, that was in business with SB Street, and then Mary Lois Loving is the last one. So we'll spend about an hour visiting these places around the cemetery. So it's really, I think, going to be a very nice thing, and we hope it'll become an annual event, and we will change people every year. So anyway, so just kind of keep posted on that.
Did
And
anyone lose an earring?
anyone lose an earring, check your ears.